As the bitter winter of 1945 tightened its grip on Europe, Allied forces were pressing relentlessly toward the heart of Nazi Germany. After months of brutal fighting since the historic D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, the advancing American and British armies found themselves facing one final formidable natural barrier, the Rhine River. This broad, swift-flowing river was more than just a geographical obstacle. It was Germany's last great line of defense, a symbolic and strategic frontier that shielded the industrial heartland of the Reich. The U.S. Army, determined to maintain its momentum and end the war swiftly, sought desperately to capture an intact bridge across the Rhine, a gateway that would allow tanks, artillery, and vast columns of men to pour directly into the German interior. American aerial reconnaissance missions soon reported that only 2 bridges remained standing over the Rhine. One of them lay at Oberkassel, near Dusseldorf, and the 83rd Infantry Division was immediately ordered to seize it before the Germans could demolish it. But as the troops closed in, a thunderous explosion shattered their hopes. The German engineers had detonated the bridge moments before capture, sending its twisted remains crashing into the river below. The second bridge, located just south of Uerdingen, became the next target. Units of the 2nd Armored Division and the 95th Infantry Division surged forward with determination, reaching and even briefly crossing the structure. Yet, the victory proved fleeting. A fierce German counterattack forced the Americans back across the riverbank, buying enough time for the enemy's engineers to plant and ignite the charges that obliterated the bridge in a fiery burst of steel and smoke. These close calls sent alarm bells ringing throughout the German high command. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler's fury erupted. Convinced that no Allied soldier should set foot across the Rhine by way of an intact bridge, he issued an uncompromising order. Every remaining bridge over the Rhine was to be destroyed, immediately and without exception. Even if it meant trapping German soldiers fighting west of the river, every span was to be reduced to rubble. His orders were carried out with ruthless precision. Explosions echoed up and down the length of the Rhine as one bridge after another collapsed into the icy water. And yet, amid this orchestrated destruction, one bridge astonishingly survived. Standing defiantly across the river at the ancient Roman town of Remagen, nestled between Bonn and Koblenz, the Ludendorff Bridge remained intact. This 1,000-foot-long railroad bridge, constructed by German engineers during World War I, had once served as a vital artery for moving troops and supplies from the Ruhr Valley's factories to the Western Front. Ironically, it was built to strengthen Germany's war effort in an earlier conflict, and now it stood poised to play an unexpected role in hastening Germany's defeat in the next. After the First World War, the region came under French occupation, and the French authorities, perhaps unintentionally, enhanced the bridge's durability by filling its demolition chambers with cement. This act made the Ludendorff Bridge remarkably resistant to explosive damage, an architectural decision that, decades later, would change the course of the war. Now, as Allied forces closed in and Hitler's empire teetered on collapse, this solitary bridge, stronger than ever, overlooked by fate and error, would soon become the site of one of the most dramatic and decisive encounters of the final days of World War II. Remagen, a picturesque town that over centuries had been contested and occupied by soldiers from France, Spain, Sweden, and Russia, wore the calm guise of a noted resort. Its narrow streets lined with fine restaurants, cafés, and shops clustered around the venerable four-towered Gothic church of St. Apollinaris, which held the relics of a saint martyred in Italy in AD 79. Yet the town's serene beauty was shadowed by military geography. Behind Remagen rose the sheer, 600-foot face of the Erpeler. Ley and the Rhine itself, a swift 300-yard-wide artery, swept past with the added turbulence of the Ahr River joining its flow a mile upstream. Threading that scene was the Ludendorff Bridge, a long ribbon of steel and timber that locals grudgingly blamed for spoiling the view, its eastern approach burrowing through a 1,200-foot tunnel in the Erpeler Ley before the line of rails continued toward the Ruhr. And though Allied air attacks after the Battle of the Bulge had repeatedly targeted the span to disrupt German movement to Belgium, inflicting damage that German engineers repaired, the bridge stubbornly remained. A planned bombing on the morning of March 7th was scrubbed because of foul weather, and in the gray dawn a reconnaissance patrol of the U.S. 9th Armored Division discovered the extraordinary sight that would change everything. The Ludendorff Bridge still stood, crowded with German troops' vehicles. And civilians, its broad railroad ties augmented with wooden planks to let tanks and trucks flee across it. Second Lieutenant Karl Timmermann of the 27th Armored Infantry, himself half German, born near Frankfurt and leading the scouting party in a jeep, rounded a hillside north of town and stared at the two white stone bridge supports spanning the blue-green Rhine, then urgently wired his battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engemann, who passed the confirmation up the line until at noon Brigadier General William M. Hogue, commanding Combat Group B of the 9th Armored Division, ignored standing instructions to push on toward Ahrweiler and order the capture of the bridge immediately. "Get those men moving into town," he radioed, and Engemann, already in motion, sent Timmermann with a platoon of Pershing tanks from the 14th Tank Battalion, each bristling with a 90mm gun, down the hillside with orders to get through it as quickly as possible. While infantry followed on foot and half-tracks brought up the rear, the Pershings thundered into Remagen, meeting only sporadic sniping and quickly rounding up German prisoners whose intelligence reports, corroborated by scouts from the 52nd Armored Infantry Battalion at Sinzig, claimed the bridge was to be blown at 4 p.m., prompting Hogue at 3:15 to warn Engemann that he had 45 minutes to seize the span, an urgency that spurred the leading Pershing commander, Lieutenant John Grimble, to radio back that he was already at the bridge as his tanks swung into firing positions and tore into a long string of freight cars on the east bank. Defending the vital crossing was Captain Willy Bragg, a former schoolteacher saddled with an impossible mission and only a motley handful wounded, elderly, conscripted men and a few Russian volunteers captured on the Eastern Front, to hold elaborate foxholes and bunkers, while the bridge itself lay wired with an electric detonation fuse linked to a control switch inside the tunnel mouth and 60 boxes of high explosives arrayed along its length, ready to be triggered by engineers at the appointed moment. On the cold morning of March 7th, chaos and confusion gripped the German defenses at Remagen. Major Hans Scheller, newly dispatched to assume command of the town's last line of resistance and to oversee the destruction of the Ludendorff Bridge, arrived to find himself thrust into a situation he scarcely understood. He was completely unfamiliar with the terrain, the troops under his command, and the critical structure whose fate now rested in his hands. As Scheller reported to Captain Willy Bragg, the man who had been struggling to hold the bridge with a skeleton force of ill-trained and exhausted defenders, the rumble of American armor echoed from the surrounding hills. Word soon reached them that U.S. tanks and infantry were already assaulting German positions above the town. Moments later, an artillery officer arrived in a rush, breathless and desperate, begging that the bridge not be blown until his battalion, still retreating toward Remagen, had made it safely across. Scheller hesitated, agreeing to wait, and together with Bragg he established a temporary command post within the damp, shadowy mouth of the Erpeler tunnel on the far bank of the Rhine. Every passing second ticked away precious time, and that hesitation would soon prove decisive. As the two German officers weighed their dwindling options, the first signs of the American attack became unmistakable. The sound of engines and the sharp crack of gunfire carried across the river. U.S. tanks and infantry were closing in rapidly, their momentum unstoppable. Major Scheller's delay had given the enemy exactly what it needed, a chance to reach the bridge before its destruction could be completed. On the western shore, Lieutenant Karl Timmermann led his armored infantry through the battered streets of Remagen, darting between shattered buildings as Pershing tanks under Lieutenant John Grimble took up firing positions overlooking the bridge. Colonel Engemann, coordinating the assault, suspected that the Germans would wait until the Americans had fully committed to crossing before detonating the charges, an assumption that, though risky, offered a narrow window of opportunity. By 3:50 p.m., Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Regiment had reached the western approach to the bridge. Just as they prepared to advance, the Germans triggered their first explosion. A thunderous blast ripped through the air, sending earth, smoke, and debris skyward. The charge tore a massive crater into the approach road, blocking the path for the American tanks and forcing them to halt. But the bridge itself, miraculously, remained standing. Only moments later, a second more powerful explosion erupted as Company A moved 2/3 of the way across. This time, the detonation struck the very bones of the structure, blowing out several of the main diagonal steel supports on the upstream side and splintering the wooden planking beneath the soldiers' boots. The deck groaned and sagged by nearly 6 inches, the sound of twisting metal echoing over the Rhine. Yet, against all odds, the Ludendorff Bridge held. For a tense heartbeat, it seemed the entire span might collapse into the river below, but it didn't. The Americans, shaken yet undeterred, pressed forward through smoke and shrapnel. Amid the stench of explosives and the whine of bullets ricocheting off the steel girders, they pushed across inch by inch, determined to seize the bridge before the Germans could finish the job. What should have been a death trap instead became a symbol of incredible fortune and courage, the bridge that refused to die, and the men who refused to stop. Among the first brave infantrymen to cross the fateful Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was Paul Priest of Flint, Michigan, a soldier whose remarkable recollections decades later painted a vivid picture of courage, chaos, and sheer luck amid the storm of war. Priest's journey to the Rhine was nearly cut short before it began. Initially, he had been assigned as a replacement crewman in a Sherman tank, a position he despised from the start. "I almost did not make it to the Rhine River," he recalled, being involuntarily assigned as a replacement crewman in a Sherman tank. "I did not like it, and after one day asked the captain of the tank unit to let me out, which he did." Freed from the confines of the tank corps, Priest was reassigned to the division's headquarters company, where he carried out reconnaissance duties, dangerous work that required sharp instincts and constant movement along the unpredictable front lines. 2 days before the crossing, on March 5, 1945, Priest found himself detached from the lead reconnaissance group of the 9th Armored Division. His task seemed routine enough: to man a road checkpoint and guide the approaching division's vehicles onto one of 3 available routes. Taking his post at 2:30 p.m., he was told the column would reach him by 4:30. But as the hours dragged on and no vehicles appeared, Priest found himself isolated amid the eerie quiet of war-torn Germany. Fearing ambushes or stragglers, he took the precaution of collecting abandoned German weapons scattered across the area. Piling them near a nearby gas station he decided to use as cover for the night. "These weapons were all over the ground," he remembered. "I recovered them from dead German soldiers in the area, fearing that someone may pick one up and turn it on me." 4 hours, he waited alone, surrounded by the ghostly remnants of battle. Then, at 9:30 p.m., the silence broke. The metallic rattle of tank tracks echoed down the road. It was the lead column of the 9th Armored Division. Priest stepped into the night, signaled the lead tank, and directed it onto the correct route before climbing aboard. By sheer chance, he had rejoined his unit at precisely the moment history was about to be made. The next morning, March 7th, dawned cold and tense. The 9th Armored Division's reconnaissance elements began their advance toward the town of Remagen and the fabled Ludendorff Railway Bridge, the last intact crossing over the Rhine. Priest was positioned farther back in the column, not among the very first wave of men but close enough to witness the unfolding spectacle. As the tanks advanced, they targeted a German train on the eastern bank. "Our tanks quickly knocked out the German train," Priest recalled. "There were many secondary explosions. The tanks first knocked out the engine, bringing the train to a stop in a large cloud of steam released from the destroyed engine. The battle intensified as the Americans neared the bridge. When the Pershing tanks halted before a massive crater torn into the western approach by German demolition charges, Priest and his comrades pressed forward on foot. "I was in the lead group of infantry attacking across the bridge when the tanks had to stop," he remembered. "We were taking machine gun fire from the 2 bridge towers at the east end. I was not thinking about anything other than making it safely to the other side of the Rhine River." Under the covering fire of Pershing tanks, the men of Company A pushed across the trembling structure. Overhead, bullets whined and ricocheted from the steel beams. Amid the chaos, 3 engineers, Lieutenant Hugh Mott, Staff Sergeant John Reynolds, and Sergeant Eugene Dorland, performed acts of pure heroism, crawling under fire to cut the demolition wires that could have obliterated the bridge at any moment. Discovering that the main cable was too thick for their pliers, Mott coolly aimed his carbine and fired 3 deliberate shots, severing the line and saving the bridge from destruction. Meanwhile, Sergeant Joseph Delisio and Tech Sergeant Mike Chinchar silenced the German machine guns in the eastern bridge towers. One by one, the Americans dashed across the span, their boots clanging on the damaged planks. Sergeant Alexander Drobick of Toledo, Ohio, became the first Allied infantryman to reach the east bank of the Rhine, followed seconds later by Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, the first Allied officer to set foot on German soil since Napoleon's armies in the early 19th century. For Priest, the crossing was both terrifying and triumphant. One of our Pershing tanks, fitted with a bulldozer blade, filled in the crater at the west end of the bridge to allow tanks to move across, he later said. Engineers also were on the bridge to repair the hole in the flooring about 2/3 across the bridge. Once the bridge towers were secured, the Americans swept into the Erpeler Tunnel, capturing dazed German defenders, many of them frightened teenage conscripts and old men. In the aftermath, Priest and his comrades proudly nailed a handmade sign on the east bank, "Cross the Rhine with dry feet, courtesy of 9th Army." The words captured the magnitude of what they had achieved. But the fight was not yet over. The troops pressed through the tunnel into the cliffs beyond, where German 88mm and 20mm flak guns waited. Our Pershing tanks destroyed some of the 88mm guns, Priest recalled, and the others were abandoned by the German troops, which we destroyed with grenades. For a brief moment, one extraordinary day, the Americans faced no organized resistance. Yet they all knew it wouldn't last. The Germans would regroup and counterattack. But for that single day, the impossible had happened. The U.S. Army had crossed the mighty Rhine, not by bridgehead assault boats or pontoon rafts, but by seizing and holding the last standing bridge in all of Germany, and Paul Priest had lived to tell the story of that miraculous crossing. As the American infantry advanced at a determined pace across the captured bridge, the German defenders huddled deep inside the shadowy confines of the railroad tunnel, their morale shattered and their will to fight slipping away. Major Hans Scheller, attempting to rally the disheartened men for one last counterattack, shouted orders into the darkness. But the soldiers, many of whom didn't even recognize his authority, refused to move. Exhausted, disillusioned, and aware that Germany's defeat was now inevitable, none of them wanted to be the last to die defending a lost cause. Realizing the futility of the situation, Scheller made a desperate decision. He mounted a bicycle and rode off toward the rear in search of new directives, a choice that would ultimately seal his fate. Days later, when Scheller reached the headquarters of the LXVI Corps at Altweed, instead of finding clarity or reinforcements, he was met with accusations. The Nazi command, furious over the American seizure of the Remagen Bridge, was looking for someone to blame. Scheller was arrested and court-martialed on charges of deserting his post. Alongside him stood 3 other officers, 2 engineers and an anti-aircraft commander, each accused of failing to carry out Hitler's order to demolish the bridge before it fell into enemy hands. In a grim act of vengeance rather than justice, the 4 men were taken into a nearby forest, handcuffed, and summarily executed, each shot in the back of the neck. Their deaths served no strategic purpose. They were simply 4 scapegoats sacrificed to appease Hitler's fury over the bridgehead that had allowed the Allies their first foothold on German soil. Back at the tunnel, the remaining defenders faced their own reckoning. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Brage, realizing the hopelessness of resistance, tried to lead his men out through the rear exit, only to discover it surrounded by American soldiers. Turning toward the front entrance, he saw another group of weary troops and frightened civilians emerging beneath a white flag of surrender. The sight offered him both an opportunity and an excuse to preserve his honor without further bloodshed. Standing before his remaining men, Brage declared solemnly, "That white flag was raised against our will. To continue fighting now would be a violation of the Geneva Convention and would make us responsible for the deaths of innocent women and children. For this reason, I order that all fighting cease immediately. Please disable your weapons, and soldiers, be the last to leave the tunnel." His words marked the end of resistance. The once proud defenders of the Rhine now laid down their arms, their transformation from warriors to captives complete, as the echoes of their surrender faded into the cold, smoke-filled air of a war that was all but over. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was a moment of pure fortune for the Allied forces, one that could have changed the pace of the war even more dramatically, had it not been nearly squandered by hesitation at the top. The full exploitation of this bridgehead, which offered an unprecedented gateway into the heart of Germany, was almost halted due to a breakdown in decision-making among the highest levels of American command. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, SHAF, held overall authority for offensive operations east of the Rhine, and within its ranks, rigid planning and cautious bureaucracy threatened to stifle initiative. Major General Harold Pinkybull, head of G3 operations and a firm believer in maintaining the established broad front strategy, argued against diverting resources or altering the long-laid plans, even in light of this miraculous development. Meanwhile, on the front lines, news of the intact bridge's capture raced through the chain of command until it reached General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group. Recognizing the potential magnitude of the moment, Bradley immediately telephoned General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. Breathlessly, he relayed the astonishing report that the 9th Armored Division had taken the Ludendorff Bridge intact and had already secured a tenuous bridgehead across the Rhine River. Eisenhower's response was immediate and electrifying. "Brad, that's wonderful. Sure, get right across with everything you've got. It's the best break we've had. To hell with the planners." With that blunt order, the Supreme Commander cut through the fog of caution and unleashed the full might of the Allied forces across Germany's last great natural barrier. Within just 24 hours of the German failure to destroy the bridge, the U.S. Army had turned this small foothold into a major offensive spearhead. Nearly 8,000 American troops, supported by columns of tanks, self-propelled artillery, trucks and engineers, streamed across the Ludendorff Bridge into Nazi-held territory on the eastern bank. The operation, however, was not without peril. As tanks from Company A of the 14th Tank Battalion rumbled safely over the plank structure, a tank destroyer belonging to the 656th Tank Destroyer Battalion suddenly broke through the wooden decking, halting the advance and blocking the way for the vehicles behind it. Infantrymen riding in half-tracks were forced to dismount and continue on foot, crossing the shaky bridge under constant threat of enemy fire. Engineers worked feverishly to clear the disabled vehicle and reinforce the damaged sections so that the heavy flow of men and armor could continue. The Germans, stunned at first, scrambled to respond. Within a day, the 9th and 11th Panzer Divisions were hastily repositioned around the American bridgehead, trying desperately to isolate the advancing 9th Armored Division and push it back into the Rhine. Their counterattacks, however, could not dislodge the determined U.S. troops. On March 9th, the Luftwaffe launched a small but fierce assault. 10 aircraft, including 8 Stuka dive bombers, swooped down over the river, managing to score only 2 hits that caused little lasting damage. Undeterred, the Germans returned 6 days later with a larger and far more advanced force. On March 15th, 20 of their newest turbojet aircraft, Messerschmitt Me-262 fighters and Arado AR-234B-1 jet bombers, screamed across the skies over Remagen. It was one of the first times Allied soldiers had ever encountered these futuristic war machines. One American priest attached to the front recalled the surreal scene. "This was the first time I saw turbojet aircraft. At first, I thought the planes had been hit by our anti-aircraft fire, but the smoke was coming from their twin engines. They dived from altitude, attacking at incredible speed. They were very fast and dropped bombs on the bridge, but none of them hit. It was just explosions splashing all around the structure." The attacks, though visually terrifying, were ineffective. The Ludendorff Bridge stood firm, defying every German attempt to erase it. Despite Hitler's rage, despite the Luftwaffe's desperate last-ditch efforts, the Allies had achieved something extraordinary. They had crossed the Rhine, Germany's final natural fortress. And as Eisenhower had said, it truly was the best break they'd had. After General Eisenhower's bold order to exploit the newly captured Remagen bridgehead, the area around the Ludendorff Bridge descended into a scene of relentless chaos and determination. On the western bank of the Rhine, American military police struggled to maintain order amid an overwhelming traffic jam of military vehicles, tanks, and thousands of infantrymen all converging toward the narrow crossing. The roads leading to the bridge were choked with columns of advancing troops and convoys, turning the once quiet riverside town into a roaring artery of war. Yet, amidst this congestion, American forces knew that speed was crucial. the longer they held the bridge, the deeper they could penetrate into Germany's heartland. To safeguard the crossing from the air, rows of flak vehicles were positioned side by side along the western bank, their barrels pointing skyward, ready to unleash walls of fire at any German aircraft attempting to destroy the fragile lifeline. Supporting artillery batteries added their thunder, firing relentlessly across the river at enemy troops desperately trying to encircle and crush the growing American bridgehead, which by now extended roughly 1.5 miles deep and 1.5 miles wide into German territory. Beginning on March 9th, the Germans began a furious artillery bombardment of the bridge, and the teams of engineers assigned to the 51st and 291st Engineer Battalions, who worked tirelessly to reinforce its damaged structure. These engineers, under constant fire, risked their lives every hour of the day and night to keep the Ludendorff Bridge open and functional. At the same time, they began constructing pontoon and treadway bridges on both sides of the main crossing, expanding the army's ability to move men and machinery across the Rhine. These makeshift bridges were not only meant to handle the massive weight of traffic, but also served as contingency routes in case the Germans succeeded in destroying the main span. Working under the whistle and crash of incoming shells, the engineers refused to pause even for a moment. German civilians in Remagen were evacuated by American forces to prevent them from passing intelligence to enemy gunners about the accuracy of their bombardment. In a display of sheer endurance, the U.S. engineers worked around the clock, often waist-deep in cold water or covered in dust and shrapnel, to keep the bridge standing, the only major intact crossing into Nazi Germany. But the Germans were far from giving up. Determined to annihilate what Hitler saw as a humiliation of the Reich, they launched one desperate attempt after another to blow the Ludendorff Bridge out of existence. One night, they floated a barge packed with explosives downstream, hoping the current would carry it into the bridge's steel supports and obliterate it. However, the effort was poorly concealed and quickly detected. American troops intercepted the barge before it could drift close enough to detonate. Next came floating mines, sent silently down the river in the darkness, only to be spotted and shot at by sharp-eyed American marksmen, who detonated them at a safe distance. In another daring but tragic effort, groups of German volunteers donned rubber suits and plunged into the icy waters upstream, dragging explosives behind them in an attempt to attach charges to the bridge's foundation. These men were either gunned down or captured by alert American soldiers guarding the east bank before they could complete their suicidal mission. By now, the German military situation was rapidly deteriorating. The loss of the bridge had effectively stranded 300,000 German soldiers and their equipment west of the Rhine, cutting them off from retreat or reinforcement. Desperate to reverse the disaster, the Nazi High Command even turned to its so-called wonder weapon, the V-2 rocket. A specialized unit based in Hellendoorn, Netherlands, approximately 130 miles north of Remagen, was ordered to target the bridge with a massive barrage of rockets. Hitler demanded that between 50 and 100 V-2s be launched over a two-day period to obliterate the structure and the American foothold around it. However, Allied air attacks on German supply lines had crippled the rocket unit's logistics, leaving them short of both fuel and ammunition. Despite these setbacks, on March 17th, the Germans managed to fire 11 V-2 rockets toward the bridge. The terrifying missiles roared through the sky, striking dangerously close. One crashed near the historic Apollinaris Church, about a mile from the bridge, demolishing several nearby buildings and sending a shockwave that rattled windows for miles. Another plunged into the Rhine itself, creating a towering geyser of water. A third rocket slammed directly into the town of Remagen, destroying a house where 12 U.S. soldiers were billeted, killing 3 instantly. The fourth V-2 found its mark at the command post of the U.S. Army's 1,159th Engineer Combat Group, killing 3 more men and wounding 31 others. The devastation was immense, but the bridge, battered, twisted, and trembling, refused to fall. The Germans had thrown everything they could at it: artillery, saboteurs, aircraft, and even their most advanced rockets. Yet the Ludendorff Bridge endured, standing as both a symbol of Allied resolve and a bitter reminder to Germany that the war was slipping irrevocably from its grasp. Though the German V-2 rockets had failed to score a direct hit, their tremendous ground shockwaves, combined with the earlier demolition blasts and the unending strain of thousands of tons of American tanks, trucks, and artillery rumbling across day and night, finally took their toll on the battered Ludendorff Bridge. At precisely 3 p.m. on March 17, 1945, just 10 days after its miraculous capture, the bridge that had carried the hopes of an army and the weight of history gave way. With a deafening roar, the once proud steel structure twisted violently, groaned under the accumulated stress, and then crumbled into the cold waters of the Rhine below. In an instant, massive girders snapped like twigs, and planks, railings, and vehicles plunged downward in a shower of debris and smoke. 28 American engineers, who had been working on strengthening the structure, were killed in the collapse. Men who had labored day and night to keep the lifeline open now claimed by the very bridge they had fought to preserve. The scene was both tragic and symbolic. The Ludendorff Bridge had fulfilled its duty, and in its death, it had already secured one of the most decisive victories of the Western Front. Paul Priest, the young soldier from Flint, Michigan, was not present when the bridge fell. "We had already moved up into the hills, climbing through a gully," he later recalled. "That was when I was hit by a German firing a wooden bullet. The impact tore my helmet off, but it was only a flesh wound, so they kept me in the line." By then, American engineers had already completed pontoon bridges upriver and downriver, ensuring that men and equipment could continue to pour across the Rhine without interruption. The Ludendorff Bridge, though gone, had served its purpose to the very end. The bridge was a mass of twisted metal, Priest remembered. You could still see pieces of it near both banks of the river. "When I left the U.S., I had brought along a small fold-out camera, and I took photographs wherever we went. I even collected pictures from German troops we disarmed." He also recalled the steady stream of German soldiers who began surrendering in droves. They threw down their weapons, raised their hands, and gave up. They preferred to surrender to us or the British, not the Soviets. By then, the war was clearly lost for them. But war, even in victory, had its cruel ironies. Priest later discovered that his parents back home had received a telegram reporting his death in Germany, an error meant for another soldier with the same name. "It was another Paul Priest," he said quietly. "Things like that happen in war. But when my parents finally got a letter from me, alive and well, it was the happiest relief of their lives." After returning home to Flint, Priest married his pre-war sweetheart, Joan, and together they built a quiet life far removed from the thunder of battle. They raised 3 children, and he worked as a carpet and tile installer before eventually moving to Deadwood and later Box Elder, South Dakota, a modest, hard-working man who had once crossed the Rhine under fire and helped change the course of history. For his comrades at Remagen, recognition soon followed. A cascade of medals and honors was bestowed upon the men whose daring capture and defense of the bridge had stunned the world. 13 soldiers, including Timmerman, Delisio, Drobik, Grimble, Mott, and Chinchar, received the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second-highest decoration for valor. Another 152 men earned the Silver Star, and the units that made up Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division were awarded the coveted Presidential Unit Citation. General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff, praised their heroism and quick thinking. The prompt seizure and exploitation of the crossing demonstrated American initiative and adaptability at its best, from the daring action of the platoon leader to the Army commander who quickly directed all his moving columns. The bridgehead provided a serious threat to the heart of Germany, a diversion of incalculable value. It became a springboard for the final offensive to come. As for Karl Timmerman, the first Allied officer to step foot across the Rhine, his return to civilian life was humble and unceremonious. When the war ended, he quietly took a train back to his hometown of West Point, Nebraska. There were no bands, no banners, no reporters. He simply slung his barracks bag over his shoulder and started walking home. His only greeting came from a small dog that ran up to nip at his heels. Timmerman didn't react. After Remagen, after artillery, gunfire, and the deafening collapse of the bridge, such things seemed insignificant. He had crossed not only the Rhine but also the threshold between history and peace.